This episode of the My Latin Life podcast is brought to you by Language Blend, the new best way to learn Spanish. Language Blend focuses on what you actually need to live and get by abroad with daily one-on-one lessons, a dedicated texting partner. It's like living in a Spanish-speaking country without ever leaving home. Go to languageblend.com for more information.
Well, exactly. I had a case of somebody I was speaking to recently. How their company that they were involved in it IPO'd, and as soon as as it IPO'd, literally all of the places they traveled to were sending them letters and saying, by the way, you worked here, your shares vested while you were here, you did X, Y, and Z. We deserve some of the gains. Yeah.
Welcome back to the My Latin Life podcast. Since 2014, My Latin Life has been your trusted guide to traveling and living in Latin America. My guest today is John Lee. He's the co-founder of Work From Anywhere. Work From Anywhere is a remote work compliance software that helps companies basically navigate all the compliance issues surrounding remote work. And even if you're not a business owner, maybe you're a digital nomad, I think a lot of people are going to have takeaways from this episode because these are trends that are going to continue to grow in the future where, we've been in a bit of a gray area in the start of the remote work phenomenon. But I think as time goes on, this is going to become more and more acute of an issue, compliance for remote workers. So really happy to have John on to talk to us all about it. Mr. John Lee, how's it going?
It's great, Vance. Good to be chatting to you again. We had a good time catching up a couple of months ago. But yeah, thanks for having me on today. Pleasure to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you still calling in from Cascais, Portugal?
I am actually. It's been hectic last couple of weeks because I was speaking to a bunch of companies in Amsterdam last week. The week before, I was speaking to the Spanish and Portuguese governments in Madeira, of all places. It was quite interesting. So I guess I'm kind of lucky. I get to speak on the one hand to governments, on the other hand to companies, but also, of course, individuals. And for me, I've been a digital nomad myself for a number of years on and off. So yeah, it's been fascinating to kind of see the whole evolution. But yeah, good to be on here to speak about it today.
Yeah, absolutely. Finally making it happen. I guess for the audience, we met up in person, John and I, in Cascais, Portugal, back in like November-ish. And John was gracious enough to show me the YAM co-working out there in Cascais, which is one of the most beautifully done co-working spaces I've ever seen. Are you actually recording at YAM right now?
I'm actually not, no, but and I do work there quite a bit. It is really. I mean, for me, as a concept, it's quite unique. And actually, I believe they are in the process of potentially opening one in Mexico. But it's fascinating in terms of the concept. It's so kind of very much focused on the community and a really amazing place that happens to be a place you can work, as opposed to being a workspace. Like, how often do we go into let's say co-work spaces that just feel like an open desk office. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
really boring, not engaging. Whereas I think with the YIM, I'd be interested in your thoughts on it. But they've got an interesting concept there.
Yeah, it's an absolutely beautiful space. I guess for anyone listening, it's basically like a house on a hill, and with ocean views and a pool and stuff like that. And they've converted this house into a big, basically co-working space. And there's no bedrooms. Every space of the house is basically dedicated to working, and they have all these kind of different nooks and spaces. And there's couches, there's tables, a little bit of everything. There's kind of different floors. And there's even a gym and stuff in the basement. There's even massage tables and stuff in the basement. So everything about it was super beautiful. From the sunsets were spectacular in the evening, and just the spaces. And they had catered lunches as well. So they had, I guess, chefs cooking it up, and then everyone gathers around these like communal tables to eat together. And I think that's probably one of the main ways that people get to kind of disconnect from their jobs and then connect with the people that are physically with them in the space and go, oh, what are you working on, where are you from, blah blah blah. I remember having lunch with like some Moroccan guys and like a bunch of people stuff. So very very cool space overall.
It is. And I think what was nice about it as well is they have a mixture of locals like Portuguese and then expats, people from different parts of the world and from various backgrounds, like some startup co-founders or people that are in design or people that are from all various different walks of life. Basically, a really nice mix, and that's kind of what makes it. So it's not easy doing these kind of spaces, these kind of projects, but I think they got the balance right.
Yeah, yeah, I want to do something similar in the future. And by the way, for any listeners that are very acute listeners who pick up on details, we had an episode with Curtis Duggan. I believe it was Curtis that mentioned that he had visited you as well with YAM, and we got to talking a little bit about YAM in that previous episode. Curtis has visited you, right?
He has indeed. Yeah, we had a good catch up with him as well a couple of months ago. I mean, that's one of the nice bits of living here in Cascais that. Previously I was a bit more that digital nomad traveling all around the world, whereas now the world is kind of is coming to visit me more often than not. There's so much traffic going by, via Lisbon and the whole area around here that you get to meet a lot of interesting people. So yeah, good to catch up with Curtis a couple of months ago.
For sure. And I guess before we get all into remote work compliance and stuff, and really I have a lot of questions about it, maybe we could talk just briefly about Lisbon and maybe what you're seeing in terms of Portugal's rise as a remote work destination and digital nomad hub. And as you say, kind of the world is kind of coalescing on Lisbon, and it's certainly become an increasingly important digital nomad hub.
Well, it was interesting for me. If you go back to like for me the last number of years, we've traveled all over the world. Like my eldest daughter Rosa, she's 5. She's now 6. In the last, and she's already traveled to 25 countries. So that'll kind of give you a fair idea for us, the family.
Damn.
Yeah. So Rosa's 6, Esme is 4, and Barra is 1. So we've had it pretty hectic, but we've still managed to get a fair bit of travel in the meantime. So 5 years ago, we were living in Amsterdam. We used that as a kind of a hub for traveling around Europe. We then moved over to Thailand, based ourselves out of Phuket. I used that to kind of travel all around Asia. Then came back to Ireland during the pandemic, and then more or less moved here to Portugal. But what was kind of interesting is going back to when we were in Ireland. We were renting a place in Ireland, and the owners of the house more or less said they wanted to move back in. And we looked at other properties in Ireland at the time, but there's a bit of a kind of let's say a challenge with trying to find rentals
Housing
in Ireland at the
crisis there a
moment.
bit.
Yeah, housing crisis has been really, really difficult for Ireland. So we had a look at it and we said, you know what, if we're going to be paying a fair amount, why don't we just look at moving abroad? And so we're used to it. We had no problem doing it. So I kind of put together this overview, and I don't know if I've shared it with you, friends, but more or less put together this overview of every country in the world. And Portugal more or less came up really, really high. Like we looked at places that were good for kids' education, places that were safe, that had good tax benefits, places of good quality of life that were not too expensive, healthcare, things like that. So we looked at all these different elements, and I mean, I guess for me, being more, let's say, as a digital nomad family, or let's say with kids, you'll have a different lens compared to maybe when I was like 25 years of age traveling around the world. So for me, the kids' education was a big part of it. But I would definitely say when we looked at all the different countries, Portugal came up really, really high. I mean, it's not the most original. I mean, I get that. It's a pretty popular place, but when you get here, you really understand why. The people are fantastic. The food is amazing. At least for what I really really love, and you're beside the sea, and yeah, there's so many different benefits here. But as well as that's the community of other like-minded people. So for us, the place felt like home almost immediately. So that's pretty unique when you're used to traveling around the world and you land in a place that really almost immediately feels like home. At the same time, I'm also conscious that it's a tremendous privilege to be able to do this, and I'm also conscious that you want in like this when I was speaking in Madeira recently about this, you want places to be great places to live, but also great places to visit, and sometimes if you get that balance wrong, it can cause a bit of frustration to the local people. So I think that's one of the things that certainly we're seeing lately. There's been a pullback on certain visa and immigration benefits to the foreigners coming in. So there's been maybe a little bit of pushback to a degree, but I do think in the long haul, Portugal is an amazing place to come visit and to work in.
Hmm. I'll hit you with one slightly controversial topic on Portugal, which is um, Joey Langenbrunner, previous podcast guest, frequent kind of Twitter commentator with us. I'm not sure if you've met him, but he's been based in Lisbon for a while. But he said that 2022 was peak Portugal due to them taking away the golden visa, due to potential crypto taxes in the future, and I think like one or two other kind of trends. And so we said peak Portugal 2022 in the past. I'm not sure I agree with that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, there's just no doubt about it. In 2022, it had so much going for from that perspective. But if you look at the whole visa and immigration perspective, I mean, they're essentially tools in the toolbox of governments. And I remember speaking to uh, people like Gonzalo Hall about this recently. And if you look at it, I mean, 10 years ago, Lisbon, in particular, was economically it was certainly a lot of underinvestment. The property market was not in a good position, and so essentially the government used the visa and immigration system and offered these tools such as golden visa to help attract investment, to help attract foreigners coming in. And there's no doubt about it. I think the with remote work, there's a lot more people coming here for golden visas, but also for lots of the other visas, for example, to work here. And it really just exploded overnight. I mean, you look at Cascais now. You try and get a house in Cascais, it's so much harder now than it was even when we came a year and a half ago.
Really?
And so, yeah, it really is. It's a but what, I mean, the positive thing is that I think from a government perspective, they're trying to look at, okay, well, let's try and maybe the hotspots have gotten maybe a little bit too hot. And the problem is that when you have so many people coming overnight, remote workers coming from all over the world, they're looking at geo arbitrage, they're looking at taxes, they're looking at lower cost of living. All of a sudden, then you have this influx of people, and essentially, what it means is that if you don't get the balance right, well, then you're going to have the locals just simply not able to afford to be able to live in some of these places. So, from a government perspective, they pulled off the tap on the golden visa. Which made sense actually if you look at the property prices that were going up. I mean, literally, the property prices in key areas were literally just flying up. And I think trying to make it, trying to keep it sustainable in the long term, it was a critical factor in it. But ultimately, in the long run, the remote workers and digital nomads are going to hugely benefit Portugal. But I think it's absolutely fair to say if he does say 2022 was peak Portugal from that perspective, I could see that argument because definitely with the pullback and the golden visas and whatnot, it's going to be of course somewhat less attractive. And of course with crypto, it's more likely obviously to coming into that net. In the medium term as well, so I could absolutely understand that at that perspective. But then I would also say, well, the perspective is also important for the locals that they feel that they can live here and that they're not going to be completely blown out of it with the rental prices and house prices going through the roof. And even for me, even being relatively new here, I can see that the prices have really shot up. So I think ultimately, at the same time, though, the government is very much welcoming of digital nomads and remote workers in the long run. And there's some of the most the communities that are way ahead of this compared to a lot of other countries, such as, for example, Startup Madeira. I was only there last week speaking to the Portuguese and Spanish governments, and they're very, very proactive. They really do see that this can be an opportunity in the right way
Hmm.
if it's managed the right way. But at the same time, in the really high traffic destinations, the pain points such as Lisbon and whatnot, they're very, very acutely aware of it. And it's a political kind of a hot potato at the moment. So it has to kind of be handled with care, I guess.
Yeah, I think I saw when they canceled the Golden Visa program at the national level. I think I saw something about the Madeira minister, whatever you call him, actually spoke out against the national government and kind of said like, "Oh, we wish we could kind of keep it going in Madeira." Um, just kind of trying to remember a headline around that, but it definitely seems like Madeira might take a different approach than the mainland.
Well, yeah, what you see is in the whole Macaronesia, is what this conference is speaking at around Macaronesia. You basically have a number of these islands, such as Madeira, such as the Canary Islands, Cabo Verde, the Azores. There's all these islands that they like. Take for example the Azores. I mean, they provide like 50%, I think, over 50% of the milk of all of Portugal. So you have these like typically these islands that were typically quite rural and agrarian, and they relied heavily just on tourism. And now they're actually seeing that if they do it right, they can attract remote workers to work, at least temporarily in those islands, and potentially even get companies to base themselves there. Why wouldn't they? I mean, why wouldn't you want to work in some place like Madeira, for example? Um, and so they're seeing that this can be a real strategic opportunity for FDI, for investment in the long run. So for them, a government, if there's a political party that comes into government and really pushes back against this, it really hurts those islands, those kind of places like that, more so than it would, for example, like a Lisbon, which is going to be busy pretty much anyway for the next couple of years.
Mhm.
So I'm guessing that's probably the background where that's coming from.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's other mechanisms and levers that they can pull to keep attracting people to Madeira. Um, Beautiful place. I still need to visit.
Oh, you got to go, Vance. You got to go. It's a. It's hard to describe the landscape. It's really unique. It's really unique. Reminded me something of something like the South Island of New Zealand. These really impressive, lush, jagged landscapes. It's really, and of course you're right beside the sea as well. And again, really welcoming people, very nice. It's well worth a visit.
Mm, mm. Okay, one more question before we get into the remote work stuff. I guess I've been
Hmm.
teasing it, but how on earth do you bring? How did you do 25 plus countries with such a young family? Um, to bring
Well,
us through that, because I think a lot of
yeah,
people think that they got to stop once they have kids.
absolutely not. Absolutely not. No, for me, that's the difference because, I think we were digital nomad family we were doing it for 7 or 8 years. So you've got to remember, even before we had kids, my wife and I, Dee and I, we traveled all over the world. We had a deep passion for traveling, for exploring the world, and then we did our own travel startup, and we said, yeah, okay, we're after having a baby girl, but we said that shouldn't stop us from traveling. And it's interesting, even now. I mean, years later, like Rosa can still do the Thai greeting. Yeah, she knows exactly how to do it. So it's and she was that's back when she was maybe a year and a half, a year and a half old. It's incredible. And for me, like, the experience, the beauty. I mean, if you look at kids' education, right? Yes, you get so much of it from a school, but you know what you get almost as much from in a lot of ways is from experiencing different cultures and being able to bring your kids with you to experience a different culture. That's a whole education in and of itself. And I think the difficulty is for a lot of us, for a lot of people, maybe 10, 20 years ago, you could bring your kids to a country for a week or two on vacation. Were they going to get exposed to too much of the culture? Probably not. But with remote work now, you can, even if you're employed by a company, you can easily go for a month, 2 months, 3 months in a lot of cases, and bring your kids with that. That's an amazing experience. That's a life transforming experience. Bring them to a very different culture where they really get under the skin. And I think with the different solutions that are out there now, such as working without borders.com or Boundless Life, there's a few others that organize remote work community trips with the family and education
Hmm.
components brought into it, where you can actually have your kids on being taught locally and everything as well. So there's a lot of interesting kind of innovations to make it that much easier. So I would argue that yes, it's definitely requires a little more planning, but it's an amazing experience for both the parents and the kids.
Yeah, very very cool. I think I'll have to follow up with you offline about maybe getting in contact with some of these family trip planning services, because I think that would be cool to get on the podcast too and talk about the family element.
Well, it would, because when we did a survey 2 years ago on the pain points for both companies and individuals. And for companies, it was obvious tax was the biggest pain point when it came to remote work. For individuals, when we looked at the sub segments, tax was the biggest pain point. But when we actually stripped out the different kind of cohorts, we could see that for parents, kids' education was the biggest pain point. So it's something that's very visceral, it's very emotional, and I think with the education systems, the way they're set up, they do make it a lot harder. They really penalize you if you're taking your kids out of school for even a week or two.
Mm.
And so there's a lot of a worry in behind that. So again, these kind of these let's say, platforms that are emerging to help address that, they are very, very exciting. And I think the traditional schooling systems will be challenged by this.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and kind of a good segue as well because you started talking about 2 months, 3 months, you know what I mean? And so let's start to talk a little bit about, uh, I guess, work from anywhere and remote work compliance as a whole. Do you want to do the honors of just kind of outlining the what remote sorry, what work from anywhere does as a company and the problem that you guys are solving?
Yeah, so what we have is we have a kind of a tax technology platform that really helps companies, typically mid to large size companies, um, be able to assess in literally a couple of seconds what are the tax and other risks of somebody if you want to hire them from a different country remotely, or if you want to allow them to work temporarily in a different country. So that's both hire and work from anywhere. For those scenarios, what are the risks? But then what is the solution? Is the solution a digital nomad visa, or is it to set up a legal entity, or is it to use an employer of record, or to hire somebody as a contractor, for example? The answers are different depending on the country and the scenario and who's doing the activities that they're doing and the country combinations. It's quite complex. We basically built our own proprietary algorithm over the last 2 years that allows companies to get the right answer at the touch of a button. The good thing for any of your listeners is that if anyone is curious about it, you can actually get free access. Visit the website wfa.team, and they can go in and they can get a free 7-day trial. So that'll give them some access to cover a fair amount of the countries that they might be already looking for. So yeah, again, that's a free resource. We have a lot of other free resources available on the website. But essentially, the idea is that when 10 years ago, with remote work, it really wasn't such a big issue. And companies typically just had expats. And if that was the case, you typically went to external advisors to get all of the risks on, tax, employment law and whatnot. And essentially what's happened is that with remote work, it's obviously exploded the amount of people that are requesting this. And so it's not feasible, it's not realistic to expect companies to go every single time and pay three, four, five, $10,000 to a tax advisor and wait 6 weeks to get an answer to the report. But if you can automate it through technology, well, then that can, on the one hand, save companies a bunch of money, but also make it much quicker to get the answer you're looking for.
Hmm. And I think I remember when we had dinner, you outlined like three or four main bullet points about. I think it was just like what's important to companies, or the three or four big issues or trip ups that people often face, and that you guys kind of help to combat and provide a little bit of visibility around.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, it's if you look at it, we try and help companies get to either a yes or a no pretty quickly. But turning it around, it also gives us a pretty unique perspective on why companies often say no to international remote work, whether you're working as a consultant, independent contractor, or an employee or whatnot. And if you look at it, there's a couple of big, there's a couple of risks. Some obvious, some maybe less obvious. The one that might surprise some people, that is a massive risk, is essentially around permanent establishment. So when we think of tax, we often think of, oh well, for me as an individual, if I go and spend 183 days in a country, I'll become tax resident, and that's a big risk. Yeah, it's going to be a risk for you as an individual, but actually a much bigger one is what if the company becomes partly tax resident? And so that's what permanent establishment is. That basically how it happens is that, typically speaking, if you have the senior management team or sales generating employees, just to name two, for example, and they spend a period of time working in, let's say, the south of France for I don't know, 6 or 7 months a year, for example, there's a risk that, yes, okay, for those, let's say, those people, they themselves might become individually tax residents and do their individual taxes. um, but if, let's say, the company, if the French tax authorities say, listen, they have permanent establishment in France, then all of the sales that they have generated, for example, all of a sudden become taxable to corporation tax in France, for example. So it can have a huge, huge impact to companies, and it can cost them millions if they get it wrong.
Yeah, isn't that
So
crazy? I mean, I guess just to double down on that, because that surprised me too. Let's just say you're listening to this. Maybe you're a high ticket closer. You're a sales guy, right? And you go to south of France for a couple weeks, and you're doing your sales calls from France. You're closing clients from France. technically you might have to pay tax to France on those deals that you closed while on the phone, while physically in France. That's pretty frightening to a lot of people.
Yeah, so the really frightening thing is that it's where it gets tricky is that some countries have a really wide, broad definition of permanent establishment, and they're strict, strict as hell. Other countries are much more relaxed, more laissez-faire, whatnot. If you happen to go to a country that is quite strict, that has a very wide definition of this, then you really all bets are off. Now, look, if you're only going for a week or two, the risk really is practically it's not zero, but it's not very very high. Put it that way. But I'll tell you, if you're going for a couple of months, I'd be careful about celebrating all those big deals on social media, and you want to be very careful because one of the challenges is that we've all seen with COVID, digitalization has helped all of our businesses. We're doing this podcast digitally. But guess what? The immigration authorities, they've digitalized. The tax authorities, they've digitalized in a lot of cases as well. Obviously, not everyone, but the challenge becomes if you have jurisdictions that have those digital databases in immigration and tax, and they just share one with the other, all of a sudden, that's where the challenges can lie. And we're already seeing it actually in the last 2 weeks. There's been stories coming out. You might have heard of them yourself, Vance, but there's been stories coming out of places like, for example, Spain and also Bali. Like Bali have put together a task force to go after digital nomads working illegally and not declaring it. So
Mm.
I think there's a lot of money here at stake for countries, and there's a lot of low hanging fruit. Again, if somebody's only going to be in and out for a week or two, the risk is really limited. But if you're going to be there for a couple of months, you want to get yourself together and make sure you've got this covered.
It's insane. And so, yeah, so many directions I could take this. I mean, both from the digital nomad perspective or the individual perspective, and then also from the corporate perspective. Because I totally
Mm.
get it. If I was running like 1,000 person company, you don't want like 100, 500 employees, 1,000 employees running around the globe, like potentially tripping tax rules with different authorities. It's just like an insane risk and headache. And so I think that's where you guys kind of step in and you guys kind of provide a bit of a framework and say, look, you guys can kind of like run around the world if you like, but here's the framework that you're going to need to follow. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to work with us, basically.
Well, exactly. And so if you think of it, some people think, "Oh, work from anywhere. I can work from where I want." Well, I'm sorry. Like, for the first problem you're going to run into is your own visa and passport. You can't work from. You can't even get access to every country in the world, visa free, for example, just to name but one.
Yeah,
So you're
so
going to.
basically it's called work from anywhere, but the whole idea is you're telling people where they can't work from or
Yeah,
can
you're telling where you can and can't. Like for example, somebody wants to work in North Korea for 9 months. I'm sorry, you can't get a you can't get a visa. You're gonna be individually tax resident. There's a permanent establishment risk. There's a whole bunch of other things. I'm sorry, it's just not going to work. By the way, you could get tortured as well. So I think it's if you look at the key risks. I mean, there's a couple of them. So permanent establishment, that's a corporation tax risk. That's a big one. That's one that flies under the radar. Um, the other ones that you have is individual tax residency. So for you as individual, you'll become tax resident. You also have payroll withholding, for example. So yes, you as individual, in a lot of countries, it might be 183 days before you become individually tax resident. But guess what? In a lot of countries, after as little as a day, you have technically a payroll withholding risk where your company is supposed to be deducting the correct payroll taxes and whatnot.
Mm,
The other ones you have is Social Security, for example. So the rules around Social Security coverage and whatnot are also something that can often slip below the net as well. Employment law is another obvious one as well. Related to that, you've got contractor misclassification. So yeah, you might say, "Oh, I'm an independent contractor. I'll do what I want." But actually, if you're working really just for one client, and you're pretty much doing everything that practically qualifies you as an employee, which can very often be the case, then you'll be treated as an employee, and that brings with it a whole separate bunch of tax risks as well coming along on top of that. But then you also have things like, for example, the duty of care, the data privacy and security risk or whatnot. That's another one as well.
mhm.
Be careful of that side of it. So there's a bunch of them putting all together, but that's not to say it's not possible to be done. There's plenty of options. There's plenty of ways to do it correctly, but it just means that you can't just say to everyone, "Off you go, work wherever you want." you do need to have a little bit of an idea as to where people are working. If nothing else, from purely alone, like their data and where they're going. We're seeing with GDPR and data regulations, for example, if somebody decides to work in a country where the data isn't safe, well, hold on a second, how are we going to manage that?
Hmm. Yeah, so many issues. It's crazy, and even just on the data one, I have a client this week that was coming to me, and he said that um, he's been working remote for a couple months for a US company, but now they're finally saying that compliance has had enough and he's got to make his way back to the States ASAP before the end of the month or he's going to get terminated. And so he's kind of looking at like, oh, do I, you know, figure out some complicated VPN strategy and basically spoof that I'm in the US, or do I actually have to go back? I don't want to go back. I guess I got to terminate this work relationship. And so
Well,
it's crazy.
the biggest thing I would say is that, I think it's important to challenge these departments that are, challenge HR in a very kind of open and honest, and inquisitive way. I mean, ultimately, for me, excuse my French, but somebody come along and telling me, "Oh, you can't work due to compliance." Okay, well, tell me more. Tell me why. What risk is it? Let me at least try and understand what aspect of it is, and if there's anything I can do about it. Is it that you're worried about a particular component of tax? If it is, you can maybe do your research on that. Is it data privacy and security or whatnot? I mean, like the tricky thing is that the risks around this, it really comes down to the risk appetite of the company that you're working with. So some companies have a really big risk appetite. Maybe especially the ones that employ a lot of software engineers.
Mhm.
They have quite a high risk appetite because they know they want to give the most flexibility. If they don't give the most flexibility, then they're not going to be able to get the best talent. And so they'll have a bit of a higher risk appetite. But then you maybe, for example, might have like a bank that's heavily regulated. Like take, for example, a bank, like a lot of the roles are actually regulated. So they're not actually, in a lot of cases, you're not even supposed to be working abroad hardly at all. So I think it really depends on the regulatory framework and the risk appetite and the industry that the company you're working for is in. But at the very least, try and have an open, transparent conversation and challenge them and ask them, look, what aspect is it? What's the issue? What's the risk in particular that's being flagged here?
Mhm. Yeah, and so you're talking about risk profile, and my understanding is from the dashboard of the software of the Work from Anywhere software. You it's not just a yes or no. It's not just yes France, no France. It's actually more of a sort of like a sliding scale or a spectrum where you say like, look, your risk is increasing beyond the 2 week mark. Your risk is increasing beyond the 2 month mark, and you have like yellow, green, red, and you kind of explain the risks that are available. So it's not super binary in that sense, is my understanding.
Well, and it's not, and it shouldn't be either as well. I mean, I think at the end of the day, what's important, the challenge is that typically one of the reasons why a lot of companies say no is because they're looking at the amount of fees they're spending on tax advisors around the world and they're saying, no, 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 this just won't work. It's too expensive. So, for example, you might want to go and work in. I have no idea. Like it could be Colombia, but the problem is they've got to spend $5 or $10 or $15,000 on the advice to check whether it's okay for you to work there, and all of a sudden it just becomes prohibitively expensive. But that's why with our technology platform, it literally they can get access to it for as little as $750. So, if they want to, they get full access to the higher end version of the platform for like $12,000. But that's the equivalent of maybe one or two scenario checks with an external tax advisor typically. So, I think it's the platform we have does help to identify where is the risk profile for each trip. And it allows them to actually recognize and realize actually for this trip, hold on a second, the risks are not huge. We can probably say yes to this. So that's the advantage of using, not just our software, but also other types of international kind of tax and remote work tax technology software. We actually wrote an article about this recently about the different ones that are available. But essentially, there are solutions out there that
Mhm.
help companies understand the risks. But more importantly, what we do is we say, look, okay, that's the risk, but this is the solution then. Is a solution to set up a legal entity or to look at an employer of record or to look at a digital nomad visa.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, because I think a lot of people previously assumed that it was just all about tax residency. It's like, look, I'm not a tax resident of France. I should be good to go. Um, but I think what we're slowly discovering about this remote work world, and I guess like whole like tax compliance world is that it's not really just that. There's payroll tax, there's withholding, as you said, there's like employment law. Maybe technically in the States you're considered a contractor, but France might consider you a different status. So there's all these like risks beyond tax residency. Not to be too redundant, because I know you kind of ran through the list before, but do you want to just run through the list like one more time of like what are uh, some of those fields that you have on your platform in terms of like things that you're checking the box on?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one is looking at the payroll risk, the payroll tax risk, which defines what are the risks from an individual tax residency and payroll tax withholding and whatnot. For example, so payroll tax risk is one. The second one is social security. That's another component. Like the social security, for example, in France, can be over 35%, whereas I think it's in Norway at 0%. So that can be a huge component of the cost to to a company, but also
Hmm.
to the individual for to think about. So big variation there. You also have corporation tax or permanent establishment, we call it. That's the one where your company can become partly resident in that country. That can have a huge cost.
Oh,
You also have employment law as well. Employment law, like if somebody ends up getting fired while they're in a particular country and subject to that employment law, can have a huge cost to the company
so
as
it's
well.
like if you
Yeah,
think you're gonna get fired,
go to
fly,
France, baby.
go to France. Go to France.
Exactly. So
Get fired.
that's it.
Record your phone call
Exactly. But
and
it's
go
true. I mean,
and then go to the France authorities and say, "Look, I need unemployment." I don't know.
exactly. I mean, it might not be quite as easy as that, but essentially, the concept is essentially that if you spend time in that country, then you'll be subject to the local employment law there very often. And so the last bit is then contractor misclassification, and that's a big one. So we're seeing the fractionalization of work, how people are looking to have their own independence and set their own time slots and schedules and have that bit of freedom. But the challenge is that in certain countries there can be a big risk of contractor misclassification. So for companies, they may not want to hire you in that country.
And again, sorry, the term you're using is contractor misclassification.
Yeah, contractor misclassification. That's where
Okay.
you say, "Oh, let's set up a contractor agreement. I'm an independent contractor now. I can go wherever I want." But the problem is that the risk in certain countries, they might say, "Well, actually, you know what? You're just working for one company. You're actually really an employee of that company," and that brings with it a whole bunch of other complexities for both yourself and the company.
Hmm.
So I mean,
Hmm.
one obvious one, for example, is that is for example, if you're seen as an employee, then all of a sudden that company now all of a sudden has to pay all of the, for example, social security and other taxes, for example, that the employer needs to pay on top of whatever they paid you, for example. So it
Okay,
can have quite a big.
can we use an example for this just so I
Mm,
get
go for it.
a good understanding of it? So let's just say um, you work for an American company, right? Because
Yeah,
our audience is probably 50% US.
yeah.
So you work for an American company, and they say, "Look, if you want to travel the world, you want to go to Bali, you want to go to France, you just can't be a full time employee. So we're going to set you up as a contractor,
Mhm.
$80 an hour, and we'll call it a day." And sweet. So you're a contractor now. You get a what's it called? I forget. 1099 status. Anyway, it doesn't
Yeah,
matter.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and then how does that work? So then you go to spend a couple of months on the French Riviera as a
Yeah,
contracting for an American company, and then what? France is going to come in and say, "No, you're actually a full-time employee of that American company, but we want taxes," and that it's kind of a
well,
weird
yeah.
like
So
triangle, you know?
yeah, yeah, exactly. So a lot will depend. Well, there'll be potentially a different profile of risk depending on whether you're directly employed as a freelancer, or whether you're getting invoiced to a separate kind of limited liability company, for example. So the risk can vary there a little bit. But essentially, if you're going temporarily for a few weeks or even 2 or 3 months, that's probably not going to be a huge issue. But I'll tell you, if you're going spending a year or two working in France, that's where these risks can become it can certainly become more of an issue with independent, let's say, contractor and contractor classification. It tends to be more of an issue when you're talking about hiring people. So it's when you're actually looking to engage people for the first time, either as employees or through employers of record or as independent contractors. Some countries are just much strict. Like for example, in take the UK, they have this legislation called IR35 that basically makes it really hard to be an independent contractor in the UK.
Right,
There's like
right. But
about a
that's a
million people.
relationship just between you and the home country that's like contracting with you. So that's like,
Yeah, yeah,
and
exactly.
that's like employment law that's existed for a long time, where
Yeah,
they
correct.
have what's it called? They have metrics where they say, are you performing more than 20 hours a week? Blah
Yeah,
blah blah. Right. So I get
yeah.
that when it's only one country and they kind of have metrics, and that's pretty straightforward. But where it gets muddy, I guess, is when there's like a second country involved.
Yeah, but and again, going back to it, if you're spending a lot of time in that country, you are going to be subject to the local employment law in that country. So
Mm,
it's. I give an example. I mean, like a very clear example that we would have heard of during the pandemic. There was an independent contractor who decided to go work in Spain, spent a good bit of time there, and then they got COVID. They ended up in
mhm.
hospital and they ended up successfully suing the company that they were working for and said, "There's contract misclassification. We actually I should have been treated as an employee, and you've got to pay my hospital fees." So this person had racked up maybe I don't know 400,000 or 500,000. I have no idea, like a huge amount of fees in hospital fees because they were obviously in hospital for a number of months, and they successfully sued the company, and the company ended up having to pay an absolute bucket load for this, even though they had been hired as an independent contractor. So that's the risk. From the company perspective. Let's say for the individual who's the independent contractor themselves, obviously that was going to be a benefit. But we're also seeing, for example, with the gig economy legislation with Uber and whatnot, all of the legislation around the world around
Yeah.
gig economy that happened with that yeah, there's definitely a lot more focus on local authorities on this. And the reason there is because they're losing tax. They're losing tax dollars. Once people go from being an employee to a contractor, there's potentially a leakage of tax revenue that they could be missing out on.
Right, right, right. Okay. How and if a country was to kind of bring the hammer down, in what form does it take? Like, how do they are because they don't really have a place where they can send you a letter. They're probably not going to get like a private investigator to like pull up to your Airbnb. Is it? Do they get at you when you're like leaving the country and they say, "Hey, you can't board this flight. Step aside. We got to talk to you about a couple things." Like, how do they actually even like get at you?
Well, I give you an example. So you know, again, it's all with all these things. The tax authorities and immigration authorities they take like a risk based approach to this kind of stuff. So if you're just slightly taking the piss, you'll be fine. But it's when your people are really really going overboard that's where you run into these issues. And I give you a very clear example. Thailand. We spent 6 months there in 2018. It was the most amazing time.
Hmm.
We were the ones doing the visa runs, which are technically not legal. We were the ones going in and out, doing what we
Hmm.
needed to do for
Hmm.
the visa runs, and even overstaying our
With
visas
babies,
by.
that's impressive, by the way.
Sorry, yeah, exactly. And then we were, overstaying our visas and paying it by a couple of days or a week or two, and pay a fine, no big deal. It was very different this time. Yeah, this time we went back in 2021 and we spent 5 weeks there. Like you could see how they were definitely much stricter. They made it very clear, like there's no, you overstayed a visa, you're going to be in serious trouble here. They were the whole like concept of visa runs. They really clamped down on.
Mm.
And so essentially, what happened, where it all comes down to is where are you going to get caught? It's going to be at the immigration. Like for example, take the U.S. Are you gonna go to the U.S. and say and lie at the purpose of your visit or whatnot in the U.S.? You can give it a go, but it's it's not a place you want to mess about with on the border. And it's the same with different countries. So come back to the point I was making. It all depends on to a large degree, how digitalized the tax authorities' databases are, and whether that interfaces at all with the visa databases. And so, take for example India. India they launched an e-visa in the last couple of years. There's lots of other countries that have also launched an e-visa. So if you're going to a country that has an e-visa, and if their tax authorities also have an online portal, for example, for doing things, then you might be getting just a little bit nervous. You'd want to watch yourself, and I think it will happen at the border. And if you leave, and if they if they send fines or whatnot, if you decide not to pay them, then that's fine. But then you would not want to have plans of going back there. But the problem is that if it's a very significant fine, well, then hold on a second, you could be potentially looking at extradition, or other aspects that if you look at, for example, the tax authorities between each other internationally, they have like tax data sharing agreements where they share data with each other. So just because you haven't reported in one country or maybe done in another, don't be surprised if those tax authorities share data with each other as well. So they'd be the things that I would be looking at.
Hey everybody, hey everybody. Quick break from the podcast to tell you about Language Blend, the best new way to learn Spanish. Language Blend was co-founded by Jake Nomada, friend of the podcast, decade of experience in Latin America. And Jake and his team, they put everything into this program that they wish they had in terms of how to level up quickly with your Spanish language skills. Because the faster that you can get conversationally fluent in Spanish, the better the experience that you're going to have in Latin America. So go to languageblend.com for more information. Okay, yeah, definitely makes sense. Um, so you think it probably is typically like when you're leaving or at the airport, or like, you know what I mean? It's like, how do they give this like international warrant, or how do they even like when it, so all these like risks that you're
Mhm.
assessing, when the hammer comes down, just to, sorry to be redundant again, but I just really want, I've always been curious about this because I've never heard of anyone like really getting in trouble, or well, maybe I've heard of a couple, but I'm just kind of curious like when they would actually approach you and how they would approach you.
Well, if you take permanent establishment, like one of the biggest fines in history was a fine of 1.25 billion euros. Um, and it was, I have the details here. Actually, somebody was asking about this. Actually, quite recently. It was the Italian tax agency. They settled a 1.25 billion dollar fine with a company called Coring. They were the French-owned conglomerate which controls the likes of Gucci,
Hmm.
Saint Laurent, Bottega Veneta, like some of the biggest luxury brands in the world. And they completely nailed them in 2000 and December 2017. I think it was published in 2018, the recommendation. But permanent establishment is one thing that can really, really hit you. What we're seeing in the last week alone, and the last 2 weeks, we've seen how in Spain and Bali in particular, they're cracking down on illegal, let's say, work and taxed by
Hmm.
digital nomads as well. So how will they get you? Well, they're going to get you by creating their own algorithm and risk assessment. And what they'll do is they'll start with the people that have been coming quite frequently or for long periods to the country, and they'll look and see have they been working in the country or not. And if they say they haven't been working, they'll take one look on, for example, social media, and they'll see if you have been actually let's say, working or announcing any big deals or whatever it might be, for example, and then you're going to get a visit. They'll have, they'll
just
have,
just closed a $3 million deal from my from here in Paris. It's like, oh
yeah,
god.
yeah, absolutely. Like there you go, set up like it's as easy as setting up Google alerts for any idiot that decides to go and announce a big, massive announcement that we signed the deal. I give you another example. Like there was
That's
somebody
funny.
we heard a good example of somebody in global mobility told me before that they watched in horror as their CEO was interviewed by the BBC and was told how he was having such a great time spending 6 months a year working in the south of France, and everyone in the office back in the compliance function just put their head in their hand and said, "You got to be fucking kidding me!" Like you literally couldn't, you couldn't be broadcasting it anymore, and in any kind of a worse of a place than on the BBC, more or less saying you're working to all intents and purposes,
Okay,
illegally in a
so let's
country.
just say so the revenue agency, they figure out we're
Yeah.
coming after this guy, that for whatever reason, any whatever, any metrics, they'll change over
Mm.
time. Maybe they use like the phone signals, who knows, it'll change over time. When they decide to come down on you, like how does that process happen?
It really depends on the country. It really depends on the country. I mean, for the countries where they've got double taxation agreements in place and they've also got tax data sharing agreements in place, it could be the case that it could be contacted potentially when in conjunction with your own, let's say, home-based tax authorities, for example. Um, if it's not the case, it'll depend. In some cases, like part of the challenge, like it's not just it's not just, for example, when waiting for them to get you at the border. It can also be the case, for example, let's say you run into a legal issue while you're there in the country. You run into an issue where I don't know, you get into, for argument's sake, you have a traffic accident and it goes to court, and all of a sudden, hold on a second, it turns out you've been working here, and all of a sudden you get one government department sharing data with another, and all of a sudden you're in trouble. But to be honest, again, I don't want to be overplaying the risks here as well at the same time. I mean, we've got to be realistic here. It's not like there's a big bad tax boogeyman waiting to catch every digital nomad knocking around there. But it's just that the point being is that it's all about a measure of how long you stay in a country, and it's pretty simple. At the end of the day, it's pretty common sense. I often try and say when it comes to tax, tax people can make it very complicated when actually it's quite simple. At the end of the day, if you're spending most of your time working in a country, you're probably going to have to pay tax there, and it's really is that
Yeah,
simple. If you're
I
going to
think
be spending most of
get
your
it
time
when you
there,
do. People get it when it's like over 6 months, but
yeah.
I think maybe a takeaway that listeners might have is they might be surprised to know that even as low as you tell me, but like as low as 1 or 2 months could trigger it.
Well, exactly. I had a case of somebody I was speaking to recently how their company that they were involved in, it IPO'd, and as soon as it IPO'd, like, literally all of the places they traveled to were sending them letters and saying, by the way,
Damn,
you worked here, your shares vested while you were here, you did X, Y, and Z. We deserve some of the
damn,
gains.
that's
Yeah,
nuts. That's nuts. Because they
yeah.
know the ROI, like they know where the big paydays are. I guess.
Exactly. So, for example, on shares that are vesting, what some companies do is they basically pause the vesting while that person is traveling abroad because it leads to an absolute bloody
Damn,
nightmare.
that's
Yeah.
crazy.
So, yeah, of course, that makes sense. I mean, somebody like whatever it is, Uber's gone public. All right, let's take a look at every Uber employee that was in this country in the last 5 years. That's all they got to do. Uber's gone public. Let's go back in immigration records. What was the company they're working for? It was Uber. Oh, okay. Let's send them a letter. Were you working here? Did you declare your? Did you declare it? Did you vest any shares? I mean, it's not that hard. That's the other end of the scale as well. It might not be when you're actually there. It might be until you sell your business for a couple of million in a couple of years' time. So
Hmm.
it's about being smart about it as well. And for permanent establishment, like one of the things that some companies do as well is they're very careful about where they sign contracts and how they even negotiate contracts and who does it, who has the authority to do it. Again, being very, very careful. If you go into a country that is, very high tax and very high risk, you better be damn sure you're not signing a whole bucket load of contracts and you're not performing any activities that are high risk. But even then, you're still not out of the woods. You got to be very, very careful. I think it's about, excuse the French, it's about taking people's head out of their asses and actually just being aware that there are some countries here that are super strict. They're super strict, so you really got to watch out.
Hmm. Yeah. I have a bunch of questions. I mean, what are the strictest countries?
Uh, oh, um, Well, so it depends on the risk, I guess, doesn't it? I mean, you got from the visa and immigration, like, I would not want to be messing with the US, I
Yeah.
really would not want to be messing in the US, without a shadow of a doubt. If you look at permanent establishment, like some countries are really tricky in this. Like you've got clearly, the likes of the Frances and Italy's of this world, but also places like India. It can be much trickier than you'd expect. For Social Security, the countries that have a high social security, let's say taxes, like that. That's one. They're the ones that you really need to watch out for. Um, Obviously, employment contractor classification, like the UK with IR35, very very strict. Um, when we talk about data privacy and security and whatnot, obviously with Europe and GDPR and whatnot, but also places like, for example, Cuba, like you've got to watch out there on the Russian network. So it can be quite tricky there as well. Thankfully, there are some good tools out there that can help you understand what the level of risk is for each of these different countries. Um, Bali is starting to get very strict now. They've started to get very, very strict from a legal perspective, but also cracking down on digital nomads in general. They've essentially, you can see Canggu has gotten plagued with their remote workers. So I think they've started to really crack down
Mm.
on it. So yeah, it's a mix and match. On the other hand, you've got countries in like the Caribbean and a lot of countries, in Southern Europe have launched these digital nomad visas, which some of them are terribly designed, some of them are really well designed. But you can see like these countries are seeing that it's an opportunity. So like in some of those countries, there'll be more opportunities.
Okay. And just to double down on that, what are the countries that are just constantly flagging red, where people are like, can I go here? And it's just like, no.
Um, well, I think you've got it's I'd hate to generalize,
I know
but
I'm gonna get you in
I
trouble, and now you're
no,
not
it's
gonna get invited
I
to conferences
certainly
over
no
there.
certainly the US is one you really like, even like a lot of states in particular. You gotta be very very careful in the US. Places like China, for example, from a data privacy security perspective, also taxes, like they really want to push you towards legal entities if you're dealing with in China, for example. Southern Europe is a funny one, and that on the one hand they're really encouraging with a lot of digital nomad visas, but at the same time, traditionally they would be quite strict
Hmm.
in terms of the definition of things like, for example, permanent, let's say, establishment. But I would say it's hard to, like, Africa can be also quite tricky in some many of the countries in Africa. You have to be quite careful how you navigate that, for example. Unfortunately, like there's a list as long as my arm of countries. Like clearly, North Korea, places like North Korea, those dangerous places like that, you've got to watch out for as well. But I mean, there's a list as long as my arm that of countries that it can be certain types of risk in certain type of countries. But again, that shouldn't stop people from embracing the world of different places you can travel to. Because just because there's certain risk, like even take for example France, just because France is risky, yes, it is, but there's ways and means of getting it done that you can mitigate your risk, and you can make sure you're not opening the whole, yourself and your company up to a whole, a house of horrors of risks.
Okay. And then on the flip side of the coin, what are the most chill countries, or the countries where the least flags are pulled?
Um, we're certainly seeing with the likes of digital movies in the Caribbean in particular. I mean, there's a ton of them that have opened up. We're seeing like a lot of those countries anyway. They have very very low tax. Um, I'm a big believer in South America in the long run. I think
Hmm.
that's going to be such an opportunity for South America, particularly being pretty much in the similar-ish time zone as the US. Um, so I think there's opportunities there, but right now it's going to be, maybe if you're a long term resident, lots of opportunities, especially from a tax perspective. But for short term remote working, can be a little bit tricky. But the companies that are chill, I would say, countries like yeah, let me think. You're certainly looking at uh, like for example in Europe, I would say places like, for example, Ireland, Portugal. Portugal is great, although we're keeping a close eye on things and how that's panning out. Um, I would say Southeast Asia, the likes of Thailand. If you look at per the definition of a lot of the laws, it's even their immigration. They don't really have a huge amount of options. For example, like a digital visa, and whatnot, that they've been working on. But I think it's a very very popular place for digital nomads. Although I'm conscious that Bali's now cracking down, so I'll be interested to see what happens in Thailand in response. But yeah, like there are plenty of really really good countries that are opening up in terms of options for people to work from. I'm interested in how you're finding Mexico, Vance.
Um, yeah, I mean, has always historically been known as a country that's very chill in terms of remote workers and expats from Canada, the U.S., and Europe coming here, and the Mexico not going after them. On paper, though, it's kind of a one of those things where the rules on paper and how things operate in practice are very different, and you never know. Like that's why you really have to have your bases covered, because you never know in the future when the policy might change and they start enforcing it, and it'll usually come as a surprise.
Yeah, I think 100%. Like that's part of the challenge of Mexico is that when we were looking at this is that there's a certain amount of local people have to be employed in any companies that have operations there, and then they have they launched this illegal outsourcing law in the last 2 years, which just makes it that bit trickier for independent contractors. But at the same time, then it's a juxtaposition. On the one hand, like you say, like the laws on paper being quite tricky, but at the same time, then you have so many remote workers, especially from the US and Canada, that have flocked there over the last year or two. So I think it's a net positive for Mexico in the long run. But I'm watching that one like a hawk. Let me tell you.
Yeah, Mexico's nice. Yeah, I think a lot of what I'm seeing as kind of the global trend here is that people used to think, okay, less than 6 months should be good, 5.5 months should be good. And then people started saying, nomad capitalists started saying we need a trifecta approach. If you do 4 months a country, you should be good. So 4 months in Europe, 4 months in Mexico, 4 months somewhere else, you should be good. And then now kind of I think what we're learning, and what people are learning by listening to Mr. John Lee, and what we're learning is that even 4 months might be too much in most places, especially angry, high tax, high social security tax countries where really it's almost like it needs to be less than like 1 month, or I don't know, less than 6 weeks. It's kind of crazy. Like that the bar just keeps the the bar keeps lowering. I guess you could say that doesn't make sense. Like the barrier to the barrier to tripping these rules seems to we keep running out of room.
Well, to be fair, I would say, I mean, that kind of trifecta approach, it certainly does reduce your risk, but you just have to make sure you're not spending those 4 months in a really high risk country, and you're being sensible about how you go about it and you organize yourself and your affairs. I think, yeah, it's certainly one of the things that we're seeing with the likes of places like the UK, like Switzerland, like Canada. These countries are putting together like cross departmental task forces to specifically go after remote workers. So we haven't seen like a lot of people. It hasn't been that well publicized, those task forces. But trust me, you are going to see the results of these task forces in the
Hmm.
next 6 to 12 months.
Hmm.
That much I'm absolutely convinced of.
Hmm.
And we're already seeing it even publicly with destinations like Spain and Bali mentioned that they're going to start cracking down on this. So let that be kind of the warning shot. And again, there's still plenty of opportunities. There's still plenty of countries where there are options out there. But at the same time, just do your research and where every country you're going to spend anything over a month in, definitely do your research to make sure you're not walking into a falling knife.
It's crazy that 1 month is the barrier now, because I know lots of digital nomads that are like, I need 3 months per place just to like be able to not feel like I'm moving too much.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, for me, if it was me personally, I would, and again, the most important thing is I say there's no tax advisor knows every country in the world, and I would always say, most important if you're going to a country, always consult if you can with either somebody who's knowledgeable of local taxes there or ideally a tax advisor or whatnot. They're the best people to speak to. But generally, if I'm going somewhere for 4 to 6 weeks, I'm not going to be too worried. But I'll tell you, as soon as you're going above that period, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, and certainly if you're going over 3 months, you're starting to get maybe a little bit pretty nervous. And And no, yes, I would completely agree with you. I mean, spending 5 months, the days of spending 5.5 months in a country and thinking, oh, there's no risk, I'm fine. Those days are definitely over. And the key trigger is going to be, when you're seeing that they're scanning your passport, they're digitalizing the immigration process. Once you're seeing that happen, then if you do that enough times, it's only a matter of time before you get the letter in the post.
Mm. So let's talk a bit about, I guess, how far back they can go on you. I know you're not like a tax expert or like a legal tax expert, whatever, but you must anecdotally know, like, you know what I mean? So we were talking a bit about how people had vesting stock from like 4 years ago and they got letters. Um, we've seen Shakira. They came after her for like 2004 or something like that, like something
Mm.
way back, right? In Spain, and they said you were here in 2003, 2004, 2005, which is like pretty far back. So do you have a sense of like how far back they might be willing to go on these things?
Yeah, and again, it really depends. It depends on the local legislation. But what you do have like a look back requirement for residency for a lot of different countries. Like if I'm not mistaken, I think France and Germany goes back as far as 10 years. Where
Hmm.
they can look back and they look back at how often you've been in that country. Indonesia, I think it's 7 years. I think in India, off the top of my head, no, India. Apologies, it was in India, it's 7 years. Mexico, Ireland is 2 years. Mexico is 5 years. So it really depends. They look back from a residency perspective to see how often have you been in the country for the last couple of years. So it is certainly one for some countries. You've got to watch. You've got to watch the days. How far they can go back, again, I don't. It really depends on the country. Really depends on the country. But you can be pretty sure that with a shadow of a doubt, they'll be certainly starting at the starting point will be the last 3 years, and it's
Hmm.
possible they can go back up to and even potentially above 10 years. So again, it's just something to kind of have at the back of your mind. Just because you've closed the tax year doesn't mean it can't be reopened by these tax authorities in future.
What a nightmare! Imagine you finally get that remote job or whatever. You start gallivanting around the world a little bit, 3 months here, 3 months there, 3 months there, and then by the end of it, you you've racked up like 12 different tax bills in different jurisdictions or something.
Yeah, but look, I think the good thing is that typically speaking for you as an individual, if you're like, for example, an employee, you know, the company will take care of it. They'll be the ones that will be making sure that the compliance, everything is looked after, whatnot. But I think the difficulty becomes if you're an independent contractor and you're the one traveling around. Or you're maybe the founder of your own business, for example.
Hmm.
Then that's essentially you trying to take that risk. And look, to be honest, I don't want to be the. I know I probably sound like the house. I sound like the big bad wolf talk with all these risks. I think there are still plenty of opportunities just because that the tax authorities are getting stricter and immigration authorities are getting stricter doesn't mean it's still not possible. Like there's still plenty of options. Like for example, option in door number one is double taxation agreements, where you've got double
Hmm.
taxation agreements
Hmm.
where you can tax equalize and you can make sure that you're not going to be paying double tax in two different jurisdictions if you
Right.
just if you just make sure and get yourself organized in advance. So in some cases that can be a really really good option. In other cases, it might not. And other cases as well, you've got the option to go to places that are very very low tax. Full stop. Places like, for example, UAE, like in obviously clearly very very low tax there as well as some of the Caribbean countries as well. Clearly, you're not going to be too worried if you're spending a time in a country that has pretty much 0% tax. But yeah, I mean, as I said, there are plenty of different options out there.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I also don't. I almost feel like someone's going to listen to this and be like, you know what? Screw this whole digital nomad thing. This is going to be insane. Like, you know.
Oh no, it is. And the thing is, honestly, what's important is that you know, hopefully after having listened to this, Anybody that says I really believe in location dependence, I want everyone to go and do whatever they want, what works for them, and I don't care if you're, if you're the founder of a company or in a senior leadership position, and you've got your team scattered all over the place doing whatever they want. I mean, you know, you might get continue to get away with that for a while, but at some stage it's potentially going to come and bite you in the ass. So it's better to just get yourself organized now. Like if you're a company, for example, and you've got maybe 10 or 20 people working for you, what we often say to companies is just get yourself together, ask your team where they want to travel to, and actually do the research on the different countries they're looking to travel to and spend time in, or what they're looking to be hired in, and just make sure that you're not dealing with a country that is, really high risk. And you might be able to get some of that even from just looking at a Google, for example. But clearly, if you're dealing with a country that's anyway risky at all,
Hmm.
you do need to cover yourself and make sure you're not walking into a falling knife. And if you don't do that and you get caught, the fines in some of these countries can be really really high. So it's think of it like an insurance policy, just being sensible. And I think people in the team will appreciate and they'll understand. If you explain to them the right way, they'll understand that look, they can't just go off wherever they want because if nothing else, just even managing the security of the data, for example, people do get that. Never mind tax, just even understanding that like
Yeah,
you've
yeah.
got customers' data that they're dealing with, that you have to be kind of conscious of that,
Hmm.
as well as like obviously the tax and employment law and whatnot.
No, it definitely makes sense. And I think on the bright side, you'll probably start seeing companies implement an official remote work policy, whereas previously, 3 years ago, 5 years ago, it was just very much a don't ask, don't tell type of thing. Um, and there was no official policy or sort of operating in a gray area. But now, companies using your software, for example, they can say to employees, like, hey, one of the perks of working for our company is you get to spend a month a year in Cyprus, or you get to spend a month a year in Southeast Asia, and sort of offering it as a perk, and not just looking at it from like a punishment frame or you can't do this, you can't do that frame, but actually from a positive frame as well.
Completely, and we're seeing like the business case, like Spotify, a year after they announced their work from anywhere policy, they experienced 15% reduction in attrition, higher diversity and inclusion, um, a whole bunch of metrics that really showed very very strong business value. So there's a business case for companies here to do it. What I would also say as well is, what we're seeing is that like the world changed overnight. Like work is not a place, but clearly taxes are. The challenge is that a lot of countries have just got a lot of catching up to do to get their legislation up to date to recognize the world that we're in. So the tax laws were formulated for a world that was analog, but we've gone
Right.
digital. So I think there's an appreciation. People have to understand it's just going to take a bit more time for countries to get there. And clearly, the countries that are out the gate with the digital nomad visas, that are the good ones, they're very, very attractive where you don't pay local income tax, for example, in a lot of cases. And they can be a really, really good option. And so for those countries, they're certainly ahead of the curve for the ones that are well designed, that is. But of course, there's a lot of countries that are not. But one positive note is that we're already seeing in the European Union, for example, they're working on potential legislation, for example, that would allow people to work anywhere in Europe if you're an EU citizen for up to 96 days without triggering a whole avalanche of tax administration and whatnot.
Mm.
So I think that's an interesting one. So we're seeing also other countries as well. They're looking to try and allow at least a certain amount of international remote work without triggering all this, let's say, headaches of tax and employment law and whatnot. So that's one of the other ones to watch out. That gives us, it gives us some optimism for the future.
Hmm. Hmm. When you pitch this to the companies and the corporate clients, do I mean, a lot of them, I'm sure, are just like, oh, I didn't realize all this stuff. What percentage of them are like, you know what, this is insane, no remote work for anyone, versus how many are kind of open to the idea within, a respectful framework?
So the ones that are really heavily regulated, like banks, for example, they tend to go, you know what, we're not really feeling this. But do you know what's going to happen? They're not interested in remote work in many cases anyway. So if they're not interested in remote work, they definitely won't be interested in international remote work. But definitely the companies that are in a battle for talent, for highly sought after talent like software engineers, great designers, different people like that. That talent demands a certain amount of location flexibility, including international remote work. So, those companies that put their head in the sand and say, you know what, I can't handle this. Yes, there's risks of doing it, but you know what? Equally, there's risks of not doing it, and that's not getting the talent you're able to get access to. Some of your best employees leaving you. So I think the risk isn't as it's not like some people think of it like through a zero sum game, but they need to think about it a little bit differently. It's not just about the risks of doing it; it's also risks of not doing it.
Hmm. Yeah, it's true. It's true. I think it's kind of a no-brainer that every company is going to probably need an official policy around this at some point. I think like even something as simple as like you can work remote 2 weeks max, just like you can kind of do like a mini working vacation, just something as simple as that. I think just goes a long way to not operate in this gray space.
Yeah, that's what a lot of companies do. A lot of companies do, for example, maybe 30 days in Europe, 15 days outside Europe, or maybe 60 days in Europe and 30 days outside Europe. I've seen some companies go up to 90 days. The companies that allow 180 days or more are the ones that haven't a clue about the risks. They're they're the ones that that are going to find out the hard way that they're in for a world of pain. But then, for the companies that do allow it, the really conservative ones will say, "Oh no, we only allow it in countries where we have legal entity." And the ones that have maybe a bit more risk appetite will say, "Well, look, you can go in places where we don't have a legal entity."
Hmm.
And so we are certainly seeing trends out there that more and more companies are becoming more open to it and using it as a way to attract talent and keep the talent that they have.
John, where is your team based? Because obviously there's a software component to what you do, and I bet you have a bit of a global team. How do you manage your global team, and where are they based?
So yeah, we're based in my co-founder Donald. He's based in Sydney, so we do an awful lot of async. Things like Loom and voice messages and Slack and whatnot. Um, we're head of global mobility, Imelda. She's based in the UK, and we then have various people dotted around the world. Tech team in India, but yeah, various people dotted around the world as part of the team. So we're very much living the brand.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And what about like developers? Are they contractors? Do you have like full-time developers?
Yeah, for us, we actually do a fair amount of development in house, basically. But yeah, we also use a mix of contractors and whatnot, employers of record. So we've a nice mix. But for us, yeah, that kind of stuff, keeping it as close to in house is really critical for us.
Hmm. Hmm. Let me ask one or two just like kind of selfish questions about Europe as we kind of get to wrapping up because I mentioned
Yeah, go for
offline
it.
I think I'm kind of ramping up to visit Europe this summer. Um, what's kind of stopping someone from registering in like a really low tax European country, be it like within the Schengen, like be it I don't know, like Bulgaria or Latvia. I don't really know what the lowest is right now, but and then just sort of like paying cash for rent in like Italy or Spain and kind of like living under the table. Like how long can people kind of keep that going or like what's kind of like the current
Yeah,
scene
so
in Europe for that.
yeah, there's certainly a lot that people can get away with, but then one of the things that we're seeing now is with the European ESTA. So there's going to be like a European kind of a digital visa and immigration, um, let's say, platform that's going to be brought in, where it'll be much easier for immigration authorities to track digitally the entries and exits in their country. And when that happens, that's going to be, yeah, you're going to see this kind of stuff come up much easier. It is definitely true with, with the Schengen. It's clearly much harder for countries to track it. But again, you know, it's all fine and well until, excuse my French, the shit hits the fan. So let's say a company gets into a court case or a suit, or somebody has an accident, or somebody falls down the stairs and ends up in hospital, and then all of a sudden they sue the company, and then all of a sudden, the tax authorities go, hold on a second, that person's been working here for X number of months. Why didn't you report it? And that's where this stuff can become an issue. But I think, in general, I would say it's kind of at a very high level, not just in Europe but globally. We were kind of in the COVID phase up until, I would say, the beginning of last year, where there was a lot of freedom given to people and to companies to kind of get themselves together. And more or less the message was, listen, use last year to get yourselves together. And you can be sure, like, the tax audits that are taking place this year will be related to 2022. The companies that didn't have their act together, they're going to be the ones that are going to find out, this year, the whether, the consequences of being all over the place. Let's say. So I think I'm kind of following these next couple of months very, very closely.
Cool, cool. And what? So Europe in the summer is pretty crazy in terms of high season in Southern Europe and stuff like that. What's kind of the
Mm.
play for avoiding the crowds? Do people kind of do like an inverse tourism and maybe like go visit Sweden in the summer, or how do you avoid the big crowds and stuff?
I think it's just so crucial to get away from the real typical tourism hotspots. Um, And I think again, when you look at remote work, it does make it so much easier to be able to visit those lesser well-known regions or villages or areas. Um, it is fair to say anywhere with the beach in Europe is going to be pretty busy, but certainly if you go a bit inland, in a lot of these countries, you can have a few more options. But even then, like, there's certain countries that really are just crazy busy during the summer, like the typical, like the Frances and Italies of this world, and of course in Spain, and Spain, for example, but many others are just going to be really, really busy. I mean, to be honest, when it comes to Europe, July and August are months where, it's there isn't too many places that are not really busy with tourists at that stage.
Hmm.
But I think, to be fair, you're coming in June. June should be you should have a few more options in June. It shouldn't be quite as busy.
Hmm. What's like the Wi-Fi situation in Italy? I'm not sure if you're an Italy expert, but like I had my eye on Sicily, but I thought the Wi-Fi is probably like terrible in some of the hotels there. Do people kind of work off their phone Wi-Fi a lot? Do they hotspot a lot in Europe, or what
there
do they do?
there has been a lot of investment in fiber and broadband infrastructure in the last decade or so. In Italy, I would suspect it's better in the north than it is in the south of Italy, but I would still say, they've been putting a big play on attracting remote workers in Italy over the last year or two. So I suspect might depend on the village that you're working in. But I'd be surprised if it's not good. I mean, pretty much all over Europe, the hotspots are great if you need to go off hotspot off your phone. And, like, for me, I mean, I'm here in Portugal now. I have like over 200 megabyte a second download speed, so I'm pretty good. That's, I would say, the worst. Let's say the worst internet connections I was dealing with was actually when I was in the US. I've traveled around a fair bit in the US, but I was actually in the US when I was there in August. Like, everywhere else in Europe I've been to has been really good.
Okay, okay. One or two last questions as we start to send you off. People love hidden gems in our audience. They love kind of off the beaten path spots that aren't the main tourist hotspots. Do you have in Portugal, or I'll even open it up to all of Europe? Do you have any hidden gems that you're willing to divulge to us in terms of lesser known spots that you expect to grow in popularity or that you think are underrated?
So, first of all, outside Portugal, a place that I cannot wait to get back to is a place called Bariloche in Argentina. I had such an amazing time. Um, in Argentina a number of years ago. Can't wait to get back there. That's a place that I'd be very curious to get back to. Um, in, let's say, Portugal, a place that's starting to, two places that are, um, well, certainly one place in particular that I really, really enjoyed, and I'm hearing a lot of good things about it as well. A place called Comporta um,
Comport
is
in
yeah,
Portugal?
Comporta in
Ooh,
Portugal.
I haven't heard
Yeah,
about this. Okay.
yeah. So yeah, you take a look at it on Google, you'll get a pretty good sense
Okay,
of it.
Pride that Comporta. I actually randomly had a
Mm,
star on this already. I had a pin on this. Comporta
yeah,
looks cool, yeah.
yeah. I was in Sagres recently. That's certainly
Mm,
a lot less developed, but somewhere like that, I could be interested to see how that goes over the next couple of years. A place that's very well known. It's not original at all, but I absolutely adore Air Sierra. I really, really do. It's
yeah, I
such a
like
gem
Arthur.
of a yeah, real gem of a place. Um, and then outside of Portugal, and then let me see, outside of Portugal, I'm trying to think. I think between Portugal now, Argentina, I really love my time that I spent there. I really am keen actually to see a lot more of South America. So I think we'll hopefully maybe next year get a bit of time spent there and get a chance to visit a few more countries there when we get a chance. I would say also Croatia. Croatia is another place as well.
Mm.
We were very very close to moving there. Um, yeah, I think that's another place I would have lots of really really good things to say about.
Can you tell me just a bit about Sagres real briefly? Because I've actually been very curious about it. It just seems very cool in terms of kind of being on that peninsula there and like cool surfing and stuff. And I did see that, I don't know if it was outside, but I did see that I think a co-living or co-working just recently opened in Sagres. So I think it is going to grow. What were your thoughts on Sagres?
So yeah, well, if you look at, I mean, the beauty about Sagres is that yeah, you've got like for example, Lagos is I've no idea like 20, 30 k away, so it's not too far away from there. But Sagres is really unspoilt, and it's quite small right now and unspoiled, but I would expect it to get a fair bit of there'll be a fair bit more activity opening up over the next couple of years. But really beautiful, beautiful cliffs, beautiful beaches, really peaceful. You're out with nature, um, and unspoiled really. So it's a little bit of a hidden gem. We had a great time. We were there recently, a couple of months ago, and at Christmas, and it was yeah, a really good place called Martin Hall. There, it's like perfect for families. We did an amazing time there. But yeah, I would say that would be one. The thing with actually what's quite interesting in Portugal is it's a lot of these hidden gems that a lot of people haven't heard about all along the coast. So I
Mhm.
expect remote work to see a lot more of that happening now over the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed Peniche, I enjoyed Ericeira, Nazare, but the water was just so cold. Like
It is cold.
just couldn't really go swimming, which is one of
Yeah.
the benefits of Mexico. Is every day I can go up, I can go for a swim. I went for a swim this morning, and I'm almost like, would it? I haven't even been to the Algarve yet, but I'm like, would it be tolerable down there? Like all, I don't even know.
Yeah, well, it depends. How, I mean, I would say in the summer, absolutely, it'd be amazing down there. So you're coming in June, I would say Sagres would be a good time to go there. Give it maybe give it a week, see how you get on, and then you get a bit of a taste for it.
Yeah, yeah. All right, let's start wrapping up this episode. John, this has been really interesting, just in terms of letting us know what the future of remote work holds and all these compliance issues that are definitely going to be growing issues in the future. I think you've done a good job of sort of getting in front of this trend and building products that are serving this market. So tip of the hat to you because you've definitely hit a very important piece of this.
No, I appreciate it. It was a real pleasure, Vance. And I mean, for me, the big thing is I'm optimistic overall because I think yeah, countries have got to realize that there's such a huge opportunity to get it right. And with the likes of digital nomad visas and employers of record and countries trying to make themselves attractive for remote workers. I think there's so many different options that I expect to see unfolding. And of course, then with the technology side as well, of course, that's what we do, but lots of others as well that are helping individuals and companies navigate those risks.
Absolutely. So the website is wfa.team, work from anywhere. John, where else do you want to direct the audience to learn more?
Yeah, exactly. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or the website wfa.team. They'd be the two best places, or follow us on social media as well. We've got a couple of interesting free resources as well for individuals on the website in case anybody's interested. They can also take a look there. So it's not only for companies, there's also some good resources for individuals there that might be helpful.
Sweet, sweet. Yeah, that's probably a good one for entrepreneurs.
Absolutely, 100%. It was a real pleasure, Vance. Thanks for having me on. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you, John. Appreciate your time and wishing you all the best. This has been another episode of the My Latin Life podcast. Again, today's guest was John Lee from Work for Anywhere. Work from.
It's a pleasure, Vance. Thank you.
Cheers.